Hello, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful weekend and you're ready for Canvas, an online learning platform. Try to connect with me so that we can make sure that everybody's hooked up and we can start doing some real work. Not that reading isn't real work. I hope you've enjoyed chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Great Expectations. Let's dive right in to what went down in your reading. So, where we left off, soldiers had shown up at the door of Pip, Mrs. Joe, and Joe Gargery, and they held out some handcuffs. And Pip thought, "Oh no, I'm being arrested for stealing food in a file from my home." Well, that wasn't true, as we pointed out last week. They were there to get those handcuffs mended from Joe because he's the town blacksmith, and it's on Christmas Day. But they needed it so they can go on a chase and try and catch those two escaped convicts that we have already met. Only Pip has encountered these convicts firsthand. Nobody knows this, and nobody would make that guess. I want you to ask yourself, what do you think Joe feels about having to work on Christmas Day, considering how marginalized he was during the Christmas dinner? Do you think he's okay with it? Fulfilling a job that he does well and having something to do rather than make awkward small talk or be put down by Mrs. Joe? I think he's okay with it. It takes him 2 hours to mend it, and while they're doing that, Pumblechook takes the wine that he had gifted to Mrs. Joe and spreads it around to everybody else. That's Pumblechook's character. He really likes to be, vocab word, obsequious to whoever he thinks is important in that moment. So he regifts his wine. Anyway, and so on page, let's see here, 33, they're all talking about what could the convicts have done? Where have they gone? And here's what Pip says. He says, as I watched them while they all stood clustering about the forge, enjoying themselves so much, I thought what a terrible good sauce for dinner my fugitive friend on the marshes was. Not a literal sauce for dinner, but just, something to talk about to satisfy their gossipy appetite. They had not enjoyed themselves a quarter as much before the excitement was brightened with the excitement he furnished. So they all have something to talk about. At the bottom of that page, as Joe's job was done and the ringing and roaring stopped, notice that alliteration, Joe mustered courage to propose that some of us should go down with the soldiers to see what came of the hunt. So it's weird that Joe, Pip, and Mr. Wopsle accompany the soldiers, but the Hubbles and Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook stay behind. Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook seem a little cozy, in my opinion. But anyway, so Joe basically piggybacks with Pip on his, carries him on his back and trots on down. Joe's really strong, and that's symbolic because he literally and figuratively helps Pip through these young years. He carries him through. Meanwhile, Wopsle, he cannot handle this journey. He keeps tripping over his Roman nose and panting and wanting to go back. He's a total wimp. But as they're getting outside and trying to find the fugitives, I want you to pay attention to the imagery here, the juxtaposition of the warmth from the inside and people's faces pressed against warm windows, and Joe's fire as he was doing his blacksmithing, that heat, that warmth, compared to the cold, misty marshes, the dismal wilderness, the bitter sleet. That's some more objective correlative. They're venturing out into the unknown. And Pip is worried. He says, I hope Joey shan't find them. He doesn't want to get in trouble. And he doesn't want his new convict friend, to get in trouble. And Joe says, I'd give a shilling if they hadn't cut and run, Pip. He assumes that they're long gone. They do actually end up catching them. So on page 36, 37, they're having a fight in the middle of the mud. It's this mud wrestling melee. And the sergeant says, here are both men. Surrender, come asunder. And what they had heard before was the shouts of murder. Okay, so there are two convicts, convict 1 and convict 2. Convict 1 is my convict, as Pip refers to, and convict 2 is the other convict. And I want you to pay attention to how they speak differently. Okay, so I'm on page 37 if you want to follow along. Mind, my convict said. I took him, I give him to you, mind that. And the other convict says, take notice, God, he tried to murder me. Tried to murder him, said my convict. Try? I took him. I gave him up. That's what I done. I not only prevented him getting off the mountain marshes, but I dragged him here. He says, now the hulks has got its gentleman back again through me. So convict number 2 has a more elevated elocution. Convict number 1 is pretty country bumpkin, all right? convict number 1 is unapologetic. He doesn't care that he's getting caught. He just wants to make sure convict number 2 also gets caught. But convict number 2 is like, oh, he tried to murder me. Bear witness. He tried to murder me. So convict 2 is being portrayed as more of a gentleman, and convict 1 has less education. And that's important for later. Look on page 38. Convict number 2 says, he tried to murder me. I should have been a dead man if he had not come up. And my convict says, he lies. He a liar born, he'll die a liar. Look at his face. Ain't it written there? Look at those eyes. And if you look a couple paragraphs down, convict 1 says, that's how he looked when we were tried together. So we have some beef between these two convicts, and it's suspenseful. We don't know what has caused their animosity, but it looks like convict 1 escaped, convict 2 followed, and convict 1 ain't having it. And so he punched him in the face. As we know, he has a bruise on his face that convict 1 gave him. And it looks like convict number 2 is trying to get out of something. And they were on trial together at one point in their past. We've got to get to the bottom of this. Anyway, they end up being rearrested and put back on the hulks, the prison ships. And it's quite sad. If you flip to the end of the chapter, page 41, before they get put back on, convict 1 looks at Pip, makes eye contact with him just once. And Pip is like, oh no, he's going to think I told on him. And that just compounds the guilt that Pip already feels. But that's not the case. I think convict 1, who was so touched, if you remember, the clicking of the throat, the wiping of the eyes, and he goes ahead and gets Pip off the hook on the bottom of page 40. He says, a man can't starve. At least I can't. I took some wittles up at the village over yonder where the church stands out amongst the marshes. And the sergeant says, you mean you stole? And he says, yes, I stole from the blacksmiths. And the sergeant says, hello, Joe. And hello, Pip, says Joe. And he says, it was some broken wittles, a dram of liquor, and a pie. And the sergeant says, have you missed an article such as a pie, blacksmith? And Joe says, my wife did. At the very moment you came in. Don't you know, Pip? And so the convict says, oh, Joe, so you're the blacksmith, are you? Well, I'm sorry to say I've eaten your pie. And Joe, oh my Lord, Joe. So, yes, Joe's not very bright, but he is one of the most genuine characters in all of literature. And he says this to the convict. He says, God knows you're welcome to it, so far as it was ever mine. He says, we don't know what you've done, but we wouldn't have had you starve to death for it. Poor miserable fellow creature, would us, Pip? I want you to remember that Pip and Joe are almost parallel prisoners to convict 1 and convict 2. It's figurative. They're not literally imprisoned, but the life they lead under Mrs. Joe is very symbolic to the life that convict 1 has led in chains and shackles on the hulks. And we don't know what convict 1 has done. We don't know why he's put there. And so anyway, as he's thrown back on that boat, Dickens refers to it as a wicked Noah's Ark. So a perverse, save 2 of each kind. They're put on a boat to be forgotten about rather than preserved. And then the torch goes out and hisses into the water as if it were all over with him. But it's not. Remember, we wouldn't have met these characters if they're not going to come back later. So that's chapter 5. And again, we're seeing this parallel of prison imagery here. So chapter 6 is a tiny chapter, and I'm sure as you were reading it, you're like, yay, it's so small. But, Pip goes back. He's so tired and sleepy. He's still only 7 years old. And Pumblechook is there narrating some tremendous, amazing story about, oh, well, I bet the convict jumped from the roof of the forge to the roof of the house and shimmied on down the chimney. He's just making stuff up. Anyway, Pip is just so sleepy throughout all of it that Mrs. Joe rolls her eyes, grabs him, and clunks him up the stairs. And to me, that parallels how Joe literally carried Pip on his back so effortlessly, and here Mrs. Joe just drags him along, But so that's chapter 6, very short and brief, but it just shows that Pip has no childhood stability right here, and he's keeping a lot of the guilt inside. He has no one to confide in. He could talk to Joe, but he doesn't. So as chapter 7 comes around, Pip is starting to come of age a little bit. He ages out about a year, okay? And so he's not old enough to be formally apprenticed to Joe as a blacksmith. That is his plan. He won't go to school. you know, like a normal college-bound kid. He is going to be a blacksmith. That's his social sphere. He can't break out of that. But he's been doing some odd jobs, you know, scaring off the birds or whatever. And any money that he makes from that, Mrs. Joe keeps. So, oh well. Um, and then Wopsle, you may notice on page 45, he is really theatrical. Wopsle has this like secret dream of becoming an actor. Even though he works for the church, he's always narrating and acting out Shakespeare plays. And Mr. Wopsle has an aunt, a great aunt, on page 45, and I neglected to put her on your character chart, so oh well. But she is quite a hoot. She sleeps through the little school that she teaches, and she tries to run this shop. But the more important character is her granddaughter, Biddy. So Biddy is Pip's age. She's like the girl next door. And in your character chart, if you'll go ahead and try and update her, I might screenshot this. She is, first of all, her name means female domestic servant. So she's a lower class girl just like Pip. And she's a fellow orphan being raised by Mr. Wopsle's great aunt. But she helps Pip learn, because she's really smart, and then she helps Mr. Wopsle's great aunt run this little store. Pip notices at the bottom of page 45 that her hair always needs brushing, her hands always need washing, her shoes need mending. But on Sundays, she went to church elaborated. So she's pretty average looking, but on Sundays she cleans up nicely. So just kind of interesting. A year goes by, and Biddy's been tutoring Pip, and Pip's trying to learn how to read and write. And if you look on page 46, that note that he writes to Joe, oh my lord, if Timothy, who is my son, who's 8, which I estimate to be Pip's age at this point in the novel, if he were to write that, I would be signing him up for Sylvan Learning Center so fast. It's unintelligible. But Joe, who can't read, Joe will proudly, you know, sing the Bible hymns with the Bible upside down. And all he does is he looks for J's and he looks for O's. He doesn't even know J-O-E is his full name. But he thinks Pip is an uncommon scholar, and he's so proud. And Pip's like, well, why didn't you go to school like I did? You know, why didn't you learn how to read when you were as little as me? And we find out that Joe comes from an abusive background. At the bottom of page 47, he says, my father were given to drink, and when he were overtook with the drink, he hammered away at my mother most unmerciful. And then he hammered at me with a wigger only to be equal to the wigger with which he didn't hammer at his anvil, because he was also a blacksmith. So Joe was abused. Joe's mother was abused. They would escape. Anytime Joe was in school, Joe's dad would pull him out. But Joe even forgives his father for this upbringing. And at the bottom of page 48, he says, you know, my father didn't make objections to my going to work, so I went to work instead of school. And he says, and it were my intentions to put on his gravestone that whatsoever his failings on his part, remember, reader, he were good in his heart. So Joe makes up this little poetic couplet that he wants inscribed on his father's tombstone, but poetry costs money, and so he can't afford it. And anyway, it's just a sweet, tender moment of Joe, and we get a little bit of understanding why Joe puts up with Mrs. Joe. You know, he says to Pip, your sister is a fine figure of a woman, and he repeats it over and over again. She is a fine figure of a woman. I want you to add that to Joe's idiosyncrasies on your chart. He says, you know, when she was trying to bring you up by hand, you were a terrible kid, and I said, I'll help bring up the child. And so really she married Joe for free babysitting, not out of love. But Joe tolerates her because he doesn't want to have his wife suffer what his mother suffered. And so he says on page 51, he says, I'm dead afeard of going wrong in the way of what not to do right by a woman. I'd rather the two go wrong the other way and be a little inconvenience myself. So he lets her beat him because he wants the opposite to happen as what happened to his mother. But he does regret that Pip is on the end of the tickler, you know. So anyway, after that night, after that heart-to-heart, Pip says, I believed we were equals afterwards, and I was looking up to Joe in my heart. Pause. Where is Mrs. Joe during this conversation? It's 8 o'clock at night. There's no electricity in 1830-something. Where has she been? Well, she's been with Mr. Pumplechuck, Uncle Pumplechuck. So, and remember, he has his own chaise cart, and they went out shopping. And the stores have probably been closed long ago because it's dark. But when they return, they have developed a mastermind for Pip, a plan for Pip to bring in some money into the family income. So I guess one of Pumblechook's clients is Miss Havisham, and this is the character. Miss Havisham is the one character that you will remember from this book. So if you look on page 53, she lives downtown, in downtown Kent, and somehow she knows about Pip, and she wants this boy to go and play there. And Mrs. Joe says, of course he's going, and he had better play there. And this is the first time Pip's ever left home, and he's like, what am I going to do? But listen to her description on page 53. I'd heard of Miss Havisham, an immensely rich and grim lady who lived in a large and dismal house barricaded against robbers and who led a life of seclusion. So think about Miss Havisham. If we're on this theme of imprisonment, she imprisons herself. She lives in a barricaded house, and she lives a life of seclusion. But she'll let a little boy come inside and play. That sounds a little sketchy, but just wait until chapter 8. You'll see more. So anyway, Pumblechook has made this arrangement. Joe is definitely tentative about letting his buddy Pip go, but nobody, Joseph, he has no real say. And Mrs. Joe's going to make him do it because this, quote, this boy's fortune may be made by his going to Miss Havisham's. So they're just using Pip to get money, hoping that Miss Havisham, this rich spinster, will pay. And think about Miss Havisham, her name. If we're talking about name symbolism here, first of all, she's not married. And then Havisham, I want you to think about that. What might that represent? We'll talk about that tomorrow. So after Pip is all cleaned up and thrown into Pumblechook's chaise cart, he's going to have to stay the night at Pumblechook's place. On page 55, he is torn away from his buddy Joe. Goodbye, Joe, he says. And Joe says, God bless you, Pip, old chap. In the last paragraph of the chapter, it says, I had never parted from him before, and what with my feelings and what with the soapsuds, I could at first see no stars from the chaise cart. So no stars. When you first go outside, you can't see the stars in the sky. But they twinkled out one by one, without throwing any light on the questions. Why on earth I was going to play at Miss Havisham's, and what on earth I was expected to play at. I just want to point out that star imagery as the last paragraph of the chapter. It is significant and it is foreshadowing. Read chapters 8, 9, and 10 tonight. You will not be disappointed. We meet the most amazing character, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. Get in touch if you have any questions. I miss you. Bye.